The chandeliers of Lady Pemberton's ballroom dripped honey-gold light onto a sea of silk and whispered ambition. Society had not changed. The same smiles curved with hidden blades, the same matrons catalogued every glove and hem with surgical precision. Into this familiar battlefield, a woman entered who had been erased from its memory 5 years earlier. Lady Helena Vance wore dove-gray crepe, the half-mourning of a widow whose loss was distant enough to permit attendance but fresh enough to command a certain careful respect. Her gown bore no flounces, no girlish ruffles. The single ornament at her throat was a pearl, modest, luminescent, and utterly unapologetic. At her side walked a small boy with chestnut curls and eyes the exact shade of a storm-lit sea. The boy held her gloved hand with the solemnity of a tiny sentinel. He was 4 years old, perhaps 5. It was difficult to tell beneath the gravity of his countenance. He surveyed the glittering crowd not with a child's wonder, but with a quiet, watchful stillness that made more than one dowager glance twice. Helena's name rippled through the room before she had taken 10 steps. Vance, the merchant's widow, but older memories stirred beneath the surface. Someone recalled a scandal, half buried. Someone else remembered a girl they had called the Omega, the last, the least, the daughter of a penniless baron whom fortune had never favored. They remembered how the Duke of Ashworth had paid her marked attention, and how she had vanished from London before the season ended, her reputation left in tatters too delicate to be spoken of aloud. The Duke of Ashworth himself stood near the French windows, a glass of claret forgotten in his hand. Alexander Harrow, his Grace the Duke of Ashworth, known among the sporting set and the scandal sheets alike as the Alpha King, a moniker earned through invincible arrogance, an unbroken string of conquests, and a face that made sensible women forget their good sense. He had never married. He had never needed to. The title was his crown, and the ton was his to command. He saw her, and the air left his lungs in a rush he could not control. She was thinner than he remembered. The softness of girlhood had been replaced by clean, sculpted lines, a jaw that could cut glass, shoulders set with the quiet architecture of survival. Her hair, once a tumble of honey-dark curls, was now pinned with severe elegance. She moved through the crowd as if she had earned every step, as if the whispers could not touch her because they had tried once and failed. His gaze dropped to the child. The boy looked up at that exact moment, as if sensing a threat across the vast, candle-lit room. His small face, so like Helena's, and yet stamped with unmistakable features that Ashworth knew better than his own reflection, tightened. He tugged his mother's hand. Helena bent her head. The boy pointed, a tiny, accusatory finger aimed directly at the Duke of Ashworth. The gesture was startlingly direct, innocent only in its honesty. He spoke a single word. It was not loud, but the room's ambient murmur dipped at precisely the wrong instant, and the word carried with the clarity of a struck bell. Enemy. The music faltered. Heads turned. Helena straightened, her expression unreadable. She did not look at the Duke. She simply placed her hand over her son's pointing finger and lowered it with a gentleness that spoke of long practice and deep, abiding sorrow. Ashworth stood rooted to the parquet floor, the word ringing in his ears like a verdict he had not been permitted to appeal. Enemy. A child's word, untaught by diplomacy, unsoftened by polite society. It held everything he had ever done, condensed into 2 syllables. Helena moved away, her son now pressed close to her hip. She did not flee. She did not falter. She simply walked, and the crowd parted for her as if she carried something they could not name but instinctively respected. The Duke set down his glass. His fingers had gone cold. He watched the widow and her son disappear into the card room, and he understood with a creeping, terrible certainty that 5 years of silence had not buried the past. It had only let it grow into something with teeth. Across the room, Lady Margaret Fawcett raised her fan and murmured to her companion, "That child is the image of Ashworth at Eton. Mark my words, the Omega has returned, and she has brought a reckoning with her." Part 2. A garden interrupted. 3 days passed before the Duke made his move. 3 days of watching Helena from across drawing rooms, of cataloging the way she avoided his gaze with surgical precision, of hearing the boy's voice echo in his memory every time he closed his eyes. Enemy. The word had burrowed into his chest and taken up residence. The Countess of Thornwood's musical evening provided the opportunity. Helena attended without the child, a calculated decision, Ashworth suspected. She stood near the terrace doors in a gown of deep indigo, speaking with Lord Julian Whitmore, a baron of unremarkable fortune but impeccable character. Whitmore smiled at her with an ease that made Ashworth's jaw tighten. When the violins swelled into a lengthy concerto, Ashworth moved. He did not ask permission. He simply appeared at Helena's elbow, his presence a cold shadow that made Whitmore's polite sentence trail into silence. "Lady Vance," the Duke said, "a moment of your time, the gardens are lit." It was not a request. Whitmore glanced at Helena, a question in his kind, unremarkable face. She gave him a small nod, and he withdrew with a bow that held more loyalty than the Duke had any right to expect a rival to display. Helena preceded Ashworth onto the terrace. The night air smelled of jasmine and damp stone. Lanterns hung from wrought iron hooks, casting pools of amber light that left the path beyond in deep, deliberate shadow. She walked until they were out of earshot of the open doors, then stopped beside a stone bench and turned to face him. The Duke had prepared a dozen opening salvos, charming, cutting, accusatory, dismissive. Every one of them died in his throat when he met her eyes. They were the same color he remembered, a warm brown like aged sherry, but the light behind them had changed. It was the light of a woman who had weathered storms he could not imagine and had stopped waiting for an apology long ago. "Your son," he said. "My son," she agreed. Her voice was steady. It held no tremor, no invitation. "He called me enemy. He is 4 years old. He calls the butcher's cart a dragon and the neighbor's cat a goblin king. You need not take it personally, Your Grace." The title landed like a slap delivered with silk gloves. Ashworth took a step closer. "Who is his father?" Helena did not retreat. She stood her ground with the stillness of a woman who had learned that running solved nothing. "My late husband, Mr. Vance, claimed him as his own. That is all the world needs to know." "That is not what I asked." "It is all the answer I shall give." The Duke's composure, that famous mask of aristocratic indifference, cracked. His voice dropped to a rough, urgent register. "You vanished. 5 years ago you simply ceased to exist. I searched for you. Do you understand? I tore through every acquaintance, every connection your family possessed. There was nothing, as if you had been erased from the earth." Helena's expression flickered, a quick, unreadable spasm of something that might have been pain or might have been bitter triumph. "You searched. How flattering. I did not vanish, Your Grace. I was removed. There is a difference." "Removed by whom?" "By circumstances you set in motion." She smoothed the silk of her glove with deliberate calm. "I was the omega of the ton, was I not? The last, the least, the daughter no one would miss. When you tired of your amusement, there was no one to defend me, no one to insist you make amends, so I made my own way. That is the story. It is not complicated." Ashworth's hands curled into fists at his sides. "And the child, his age, Helena, do the arithmetic for me." She did not flinch at his use of her Christian name. She simply tilted her head and regarded him as one might regard a disappointing exhibit at a museum. "The arithmetic tells a story you are not prepared to hear, and even if you were, I am not obliged to recite it. Good evening, Your Grace." She turned and walked back toward the blazing windows of the Thornwood music room. Ashworth watched her go, her indigo gown swallowing the lantern light, her spine a straight, unassailable line. He had faced opponents in Parliament, rivals on the dueling field, and the collective disapproval of the House of Lords. None of them had made him feel as powerless as this woman who refused to grant him a single concession. He stood alone in the dark garden, the words still burning in his ears. "Enemy." He would have the truth, by whatever means necessary. He would have it. But somewhere beneath the aristocratic fury, a colder, quieter voice whispered that he might not like what the truth revealed about himself. Part 3. The Duke's Discovery. The man Ashworth hired was discreet, expensive, and utterly without sentiment. Within a fortnight, a slim leather folio lay on the Duke's mahogany desk, its contents more damning than any parliamentary report. Helena Mary Barlow, youngest daughter of Baron Enderby, had departed London in late April of 1817. She had travelled not to the family's crumbling estate in Dorset, but to a modest cottage in Yorkshire, arranged through a solicitor her father had never met. A merchant named Silas Vance, 20 years her senior and in failing health, had married her in a quiet ceremony 6 weeks after her arrival. The parish register recorded the marriage. A second entry, dated 7 months later, recorded the baptism of Nicholas Silas Vance. The arithmetic, as she had so coldly suggested, told its own story. The child was born 7 months after the wedding. He had been conceived at least 2 months before it. The window aligned precisely with the final weeks Helena had spent in London, with the nights she had spent in Ashworth's arms, believing promises he had never intended to keep. The Duke closed the folio and pressed his palms flat against the cool leather of his desktop. The room around him, the soaring bookshelves, the ancestral portraits, the marble fireplace carved with the Harrow crest, felt hollow. He had an heir, a son, a boy who called him enemy. He went to her the following afternoon. No note preceded him, no footman announced his arrival. He simply appeared on the doorstep of her rented townhouse on Curzon Street, his carriage blocking the narrow lane, his expression that of a man who had not slept. The maid who answered looked terrified. Helena herself came to the parlor door, wiping flour from her hands. She had been in the kitchen, of all places, teaching the cook a receipt for lemon biscuits. She wore a simple muslin gown, her hair escaping its pins, and she looked more formidable than any dowager in full court dress. "Your Grace," she said, "you were not invited. I need to speak with you. The need is yours, I do not share it." From behind her skirts a small voice piped up, "Mamma, is it the bad man again?" Nicholas appeared, clutching a wooden horse in one grubby fist. He stared at Ashworth with that unnervingly direct gaze, the same storm-sea eyes that the Duke saw every morning in his own shaving mirror. The boy's lower lip jutted with a defiance that was painfully familiar. "Enemy," Nicholas said, not with heat but with a child's implacable certainty. Helena crouched beside her son. "Darling, go to nurse. I shall be up presently." Nicholas did not move. He stepped in front of his mother, a miniature barricade of 4-year-old outrage, and repeated the word, "Enemy." Ashworth's throat closed. He had commanded regiments on the peninsula. He had stared down the Prince Regent himself. But standing in this modest parlor, confronted by a boy who barely reached his knee, he felt something inside him crack along a fault line he had never known existed. "I know," he said, his voice roughened to gravel. "I know what I am to you, but I have come to speak with your mother. I am not here to hurt her." Nicholas considered this with the skepticism of a seasoned diplomat. "You hurted her before." The silence that followed was absolute. Helena's face lost a shade of color, but she did not correct her son. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that held both protection and quiet pride. "Nurse," she called, and a sturdy woman appeared to scoop Nicholas away despite his protests. When the door closed, Helena turned back to the Duke. Her composure had returned, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears held back by sheer force of will. "You know," she said, "it was not a question. I know he is my son." She did not deny it. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, her silhouette framed by gray afternoon light. "I gave you no right to that knowledge. You took it, as you take everything." "Why did you not tell me?" The question tore out of him, raw and ungoverned. I would have. You would have done what precisely? She turned, and the look she gave him was not anger, it was worse, it was exhaustion. Married me. A duke does not marry the Omega of the Ton. You would have offered money, a quiet arrangement, a child hidden away with a pension and a false name. I chose to give him a father who would claim him openly, even if that father was not his blood. Silas Vance gave Nicholas his name without a moment's hesitation. Can you say you would have done the same? The Duke could not speak. The truth of her words was a blade, and she had slid it between his ribs with surgical precision. I did not vanish, Helena continued quietly. I made a choice. I chose my son's dignity over your convenience. I will continue to make that choice every day for the rest of my life. Now please leave. Ashworth did not leave, not yet. He stood in the center of the worn carpet, a duke in a room that was too small for his title and far too large for his sins, and he understood that he had never deserved her. Not then, not now. But he was, for the first time in his arrogant life, beginning to want to. Part 4. A Rival's Quiet Courtship. Lord Julian Whitmore possessed none of the attributes that made the Duke of Ashworth the alpha king of the Ton. He was not tall. He was not commanding. He did not enter a room like a storm front rolling over the channel. He was simply a man of 32 with kind eyes, a comfortable estate in Sussex, and a manner so gentle that the matchmaking mammas had long since written him off as hopeless. He had known Helena Barlow before her disgrace. He had danced with her once at a country assembly in her girlhood and had never forgotten the way she laughed, unself-consciously, with her whole body. When she reappeared in London as Lady Vance, a widow with a child, he recognized something in her that the gossips missed, not scandal but survival. His courtship was a study in quiet persistence. He sent no extravagant bouquets, only small posies of wildflowers that reminded her, he said, of the Dorset meadows where they had first met. He did not monopolize her at parties. He simply appeared at her elbow when the crowd grew too thick, offering a steady presence that asked nothing and promised everything. Ashworth watched from a distance, and the watching corroded him. The crisis came at Lady Castlereagh's ball. Whitmore had secured Helena's hand for a country dance, a livelier set than her widow's status typically permitted, but Whitmore's gentle smile had coaxed her onto the floor. She looked almost happy. The weight she carried seemed, for a moment, to lift from her shoulders. Ashworth could not bear it. He crossed the ballroom with the directness of a man who had never been denied anything, and he intercepted them as the dance ended. "Lady Vance," he said, his voice pitched to Carrie, "I believe the next set is mine." The statement was an impossibility. He had not asked, she had not accepted. Whitmore stiffened beside her, his pleasant face hardening into something resolute. "Her ladyship is engaged to me for the next," Whitmore said calmly, "and the one after if she wishes." "I think not." Ashworth's smile was a blade wrapped in velvet. "Lady Vance and I have unfinished business. Surely you would not stand in the way of a private conversation between old acquaintances." The word acquaintances dripped with insinuation. The dancers nearest them had stopped moving. Fans fluttered. Whispers began to spread like ink through water. Helena's expression did not change, but her hand tightened on Whitmore's arm. "Your Grace," she said, "you are making a spectacle. I have nothing to say to you that cannot be said in a public room. If you have something to communicate, do so now, or release me to my partner." Ashworth's gaze flicked to Whitmore, assessing, dismissive, and finally landing on Helena with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged. "I have discovered certain truths, truths that change everything, and I will not discuss them while you cling to the arm of a man who has no claim on you." Whitmore stepped forward. The movement was small, but it placed him squarely between Helena and the Duke. "I have the claim of genuine regard," he said quietly, "which is more than you have ever offered anyone." Ashworth stepped back. The room held its breath. A duke and a baron, squared off like bucks in rutting season, with a widow in half-mourning caught between them. The scandal would be magnificent. Helena ended it. She released Whitmore's arm and faced Ashworth alone. "You wish to speak of truths. Here is one. I was never yours to claim. I am not yours now. Whatever you have discovered, it does not alter that fact. Good evening." She took Whitmore's arm again and walked away, her head high, her steps measured. The crowd parted. The Duke stood motionless, the eyes of the ton upon him, and felt the ground beneath his feet shift in a way he could not name. Julian Whitmore escorted Helena to the refreshment table and pressed a glass of lemonade into her hand. His own hands were steady, though a pulse beat visibly at his temple. "You need not explain anything to me," he said, "but if you ever wish to, I will listen." Helena looked at him, this quiet, unassuming man who had offered her wildflowers and asked for nothing, and felt the sting of tears she refused to shed. "You are a good man, Lord Whitmore." "I am a patient one," he replied, "and I have waited 5 years to see you smile again. I can wait a little longer." Across the ballroom, the Alpha King stood alone, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose something he had never possessed. Part 5: Fever in Forgotten Walls. The fever struck without warning. Nicholas had been restless at breakfast, pushing his porridge around the bowl with a listless spoon. By midday, his cheeks burned crimson and his small body shook with chills that no number of blankets could ease. The physician Helena summoned, a harried man with a fraying collar, murmured frightening words: "Putrid sore throat, possible scarlet fever. The child must be watched through the night." Helena did not leave her son's bedside. She held his hot, dry hand and sang lullabies in a voice that cracked with exhaustion and terror. The candles burned low. The house on Curzon Street fell silent except for the rasp of Nicholas's labored breathing and the distant chime of a clock marking hours that felt like decades. The Duke arrived at 11 o'clock. He had not been sent for. He had simply heard, through the invisible network of servants and gossip that connected every great house in London, that Lady Vance's child was dangerously ill. He brought with him Sir Percival Hargrave, the most sought-after physician in the city, a man who ordinarily attended only the royal family and those dukes who could afford his astronomical fees. The maid tried to refuse him entry. Ashworth walked past her as if she were made of mist. He found Helena in the nursery, a dim room lit by a single shaded lamp. She looked up when he entered, and her face was not the composed mask he had grown accustomed to. It was raw, exhausted, stripped of all defenses. She had been crying. The tracks of tears still glistened on her cheeks. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was a thread. "Saving your son," he gestured, and Sir Percival stepped forward with his bag of instruments. "This man is the best. He will not leave until the boy is out of danger." Helena's resistance crumbled. She did not have the strength to refuse. She simply nodded and moved aside so the physician could examine Nicholas, who whimpered and thrashed and called for his mamma in a voice that tore at every heart in the room. The night that followed was a crucible. Sir Percival administered cool compresses, herbal draughts, and a fierce, unrelenting attention that allowed no room for despair. Ashworth did not leave. He stationed himself in a chair by the window, a silent sentinel in evening dress, and watched Helena watch her son. At some point, exhaustion claimed her. She slumped forward, her head dropping onto the edge of Nicholas's bed. Ashworth rose, hesitated, then lifted her gently and carried her to a chaise in the corner. She did not wake. She curled into the cushions like a child seeking shelter from a storm, and he covered her with his own coat. He returned to his chair and resumed his vigil. Dawn crept through the curtains in shades of pearl and rose. Sir Percival straightened from the bed and nodded, the tension draining from his lined face. "The fever has broken. The boy will recover. He needs rest and fluids, but the danger is past." Helena stirred as if the words had reached her in sleep. She opened her eyes and saw Ashworth still sitting in the chair, his cravat loosened, his hair disheveled, his face gray with a fatigue that had nothing to do with a single sleepless night. It was the weariness of a man who had been fighting something far longer. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed." Nicholas stirred. His eyes fluttered open, clear now, the fever's glaze receding. He looked at his mother, then at the Duke. His small brow furrowed. He was too weak for defiance, too drained for the familiar word. Instead, a sound escaped him, soft and questioning, a syllable that was not quite enemy, but something closer to a tentative, bewildered why. Ashworth leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped as if in prayer. "Because I am he stopped. The word father lodged in his throat. He was not that yet. He had no right to it. "Because I am here," he finished. "And I will not leave." Helena rose from the chaise. The Duke's coat slipped from her shoulders, and she folded it carefully, holding it against her chest as if it were armor. She looked at him, this arrogant, impossible man who had broken her heart and was now trying with agonizing slowness to piece it back together. "Thank you," she said, 2 words. They were not forgiveness, they were not permission, but they were a door cracked open by a fraction, and Ashworth understood that he had been given something he did not deserve, a chance. He left as the sun rose fully, walking out into a London morning that smelled of bread and coal smoke and improbable hope. Behind him, in a quiet nursery, a boy who had called him enemy drifted into healing sleep, and a woman who had every right to hate him began, against all reason, to wonder. Part 6. The Scandal Breaks. The Ton discovered the truth within a week. Such secrets could not survive the furnace of London society, not when servants whispered and physicians, assistants gossiped in taverns. The story spread with the virulence of the fever that had nearly claimed Nicholas. The Duke of Ashworth had a natural son, hidden away beneath a dead merchant's name, and the child's mother was the very Omega he had ruined and discarded 5 years earlier. The cut direct came first from Lady Jersey, delivered at Almack, with the precision of a guillotine blade. Helena stood in the center of the assembly rooms, her voucher clutched in her gloved hand, and watched the patronesses turn their backs in perfect, synchronized disdain. The whispers that followed were not even whispered. They were spoken aloud, deliberately, so she might hear every syllable. Always knew she was no better than she ought to be. Poor Mr. Vance, saddled with another man, byblow. The child has the harrow look, anyone can see it. Helena did not crumble. She walked out of Almack, with her spine straight and her face composed, but inside she was bleeding. Nicholas was still convalescing at home, too weak to understand the storm gathering around his small existence. She had to protect him. She had no idea how. The Duke acted with a decisiveness that surprised even himself. He appeared at Lady Thornwood's drawing room 3 days later, where the cream of society had gathered for afternoon tea and ritual character assassination. Helena was present only because she refused to hide. Whitmore stood beside her, steadfast as granite, but even his quiet support could not shield her from the Arctic chill of 40 disapproving matrons. Ashworth entered without announcement. The room, which had been buzzing with the happy malice of shared scandal, fell abruptly quiet. He walked directly to the center of the Aubusson carpet, turned to face the assembled company, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner. "I have an announcement." Lady Thornwood rose from her chair, her face a study in affronted propriety. "Your Grace, this is most irregular." "I am aware." He did not look at her. His gaze found Helena and held. "I am here to correct a falsehood that has circulated through this room and every other in London. Lady Helena Vance is not a woman of loose morals. She is the mother of my son." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Fans snapped open. Someone dropped a teacup. The Duke continued, his voice steady and strangely hollow, as if he were reciting a confession he had rehearsed 1,000 times in the privacy of his own head. "I pursued her 5 years ago. I made promises I did not keep. When she discovered she was with child, I was not there to offer protection because I was too proud and too careless to be the man she deserved. She married a good man who gave my son his name. She raised that boy alone, without help, without acknowledgement, without a single word of reproach against me. She has borne the shame that belongs to me." He paused. The silence was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. "I have come here to ask Lady Vance to be my wife, publicly, before all of you, so that there can be no doubt, not of her virtue, not of her honor, not of my intentions. I will give her my name, my title, and my whole heart, if she will have it. I will claim Nicholas as my legitimate heir before the House of Lords. I will spend the rest of my life earning the forgiveness she owes me nothing to give." He turned to Helena. His arrogant mask was gone, stripped away by the gravity of the moment. What remained was a man, simply a man, standing vulnerable before the woman he had wronged and the society that had condemned her. Helena rose from her chair. Whitmore released her arm, his expression unreadable but not unkind. She walked toward the Duke, and the crowd parted for her as it had at that first ball, weeks and a lifetime ago. She stopped an arm's length away. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but carried the weight of iron. "You offer me your name. You offer your title. You offer your public contrition before a room full of people who will forget this moment by next season." She paused, and the air between them hummed with tension. "I do not want a duke. I do not want a grand gesture designed to rescue your reputation as much as mine. I want a father for my son. A man who will read to him at night and teach him to ride and stay through fevers and tantrums and all the thousand small trials of raising a child. Can you be that man, not the Alpha King, not the Duke of Ashworth, just a father?" The room waited. Ashworth closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were wet. "I can try," he said. "I will try every day for the rest of my life." Helena looked at him, really looked past the title and the arrogance and the shattered pride, into the flawed, frightened, stubborn heart beneath. She saw something she had not expected to find, a beginning. "Then prove it," she said. "Not here, not in front of an audience. Prove it quietly over time in the small moments no one else will ever see. Do that and I will give you my answer." She did not accept his proposal, but she did not refuse it either. She left the drawing room with her son's future cradled in her hands, and the Duke of Ashworth stood alone in a sea of bewildered aristocrats, understanding that the hardest battle of his life had just begun. Part 7. Enemy becomes Papa. Spring came to London with an uncharacteristic gentleness, coaxing blossoms from the plane trees and softening the sooty edges of the city with pale green light. The Duke of Ashworth did not return to his clubs or his political machinations. He did not attend the remaining events of the season. Instead, he did something that baffled the ton and transformed the quiet townhouse on Curzon Street into the most talked-about address in Mayfair. He showed up. Not grandly, not with flowers or jewels or any of the ostentatious gestures a duke might deploy to purchase forgiveness. He simply appeared every morning at 10 o'clock, carrying a book under his arm. If Helena permitted it, he would read to Nicholas. Adventure stories mostly, tales of knights and dragons that made the boy's eyes go wide. Sometimes Helena did not permit it, and he would leave the book with the maid and walk away without complaint. He learned Nicholas's favorite biscuits ginger, with a hint of lemon. He discovered that the boy was terrified of thunderstorms and adored the organ grinder's monkey that performed on the corner of Berkeley Square. He sat through a puppet show in the nursery, his long legs folded awkwardly into a child-sized chair, and applauded with genuine enthusiasm when the dragon was defeated. He did not push, he did not demand, he waited. Helena watched him with a wariness that slowly, incrementally, softened into something else. She saw the way his hands gentled when he lifted Nicholas from a fall. She heard the patience in his voice when the boy asked the same question 5 times in succession. She noticed that he never once mentioned the title or the inheritance or the future he was so desperate to claim. He was, with agonizing slowness, becoming what she had asked him to be, not a duke, but a father. The turning point arrived in April, at a garden party hosted by Lady Whitmore, Julian's formidable aunt, who had decided to champion Helena out of sheer bloody-mindedness against the rest of the ton. Nicholas, now fully recovered and bursting with the energy of a healthy 5-year-old, darted between the flower beds chasing a butterfly, his laughter ringing through the perfumed air. Ashworth stood at the edge of the lawn, talking quietly with Whitmore himself. The two men had reached an uneasy truce, forged in mutual respect, and a shared understanding that Helena's happiness mattered more than either of their prides. Whitmore had withdrawn his suit with grace, confessing that he had seen the way she looked at the Duke when she thought no one was watching. Nicholas spotted Ashworth across the grass. He stopped chasing the butterfly. For a long moment he simply stood there, his small chest heaving, his expression undergoing a complex negotiation that only a child's face can convey. Then he walked, not ran, toward the Duke. The garden's chatter dimmed. Everyone remembered what the child had called Ashworth at that first ball. Enemy. The word had become part of the scandal's lore, whispered and embellished until it had taken on the weight of legend. Nicholas stopped in front of the Duke. He looked up and up at the tall man who had once been the villain of every story his mother had ever told him without telling him. His brow furrowed. His mouth worked. "You stayed," the boy said. It was not a question. It was an observation, delivered with a child's unerring instinct for truth. The Duke crouched down, bringing himself to Nicholas's eye level. His voice was rough with emotion he did not try to hide. "I will always stay, for as long as you and your mother will let me." Nicholas considered this. He looked back at his mother, who stood frozen beside a rose arbor, her hand pressed to her heart. Then he looked at the man before him, this man who had read him stories and brought him ginger biscuits and held his hand through a thunderstorm while pretending he wasn't terrified of the lightning himself. He reached out and tugged the Duke's sleeve. "Papa," he said. The word fell into the garden's stillness like a stone into still water. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It changed everything. Ashworth's composure shattered. He gathered the boy into his arms and held him, his shoulders shaking, his face buried in Nicholas's chestnut curls. When he looked up, his eyes found Helena, and the question in them was no longer a demand. It was a plea. She walked toward them across the sun-dappled grass, her skirts brushing the new clover, and she did not look at the watching crowd. She did not care about the watching crowd. She knelt beside the man who had broken her and the son he had unknowingly given her, and she placed her hand over his where it rested on Nicholas's back. "Yes," she said. The Duke of Ashworth, the Alpha King, the arrogant lord who had once believed the world was his to command, wept openly in a garden full of witnesses. He did not care. He had spent 5 years building walls and one spring tearing them down, and the woman he had wronged was offering him something he had never dared to expect: a family. They were married 3 weeks later in the village church near Whitmore's Sussex estate, with Julian himself standing as witness, and a congregation of wildflowers nodding in the open windows. Nicholas, resplendent in a miniature coat of blue velvet, carried the ring on a satin pillow and announced to anyone who would listen that his papa was not an enemy anymore. The ton buzzed for months. Scandals faded. Other stories took their place. But in a quiet nursery in Ashworth House, a Duke read adventure stories to a boy who had once called him the worst name a child could bestow, and a woman who had been the Omega of the ton sat in the window seat, watching them with a peace she had fought 5 years to earn. She had returned with a child who called the Alpha King enemy. She had stayed to watch him become Papa. And in the end, she had not been rescued. She had simply allowed a broken man to prove that broken things could be mended, if only one was willing to do the quiet, unglamorous work of love. The end.